Hello lovely people, welcome to another book chat, the regular roundup of stuff I've read at some point in my past. I have 4 books to talk about this week and I'm just going to crack on with it.
Sophie Vlogs.
First up is Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. I have to be really careful with this copy because the cover fully just comes off of the book. This is a very famous book. The only things I really knew about this going in is that this book had to be smuggled out of Russia at the time of its publication because it wouldn't be printed there. And we're following this guy called Dr. Zhivago, and this big cast of characters that are like interlinked to his story. But really what we're doing is this is like a critical look at the Russian Revolution. This was a really interesting read. I think when I started it, because there are so many characters in this, and then the nature of Russian naming means that all of these individual characters have multiple names that they can be referred to throughout the text. The thing that initially drew me into this book is there are some really gorgeous and atmospheric descriptions of the scenery and the physicality of Russia, and that was one thing that I found as I read this, is these descriptions of place really helped me feel grounded, and because it spans across such a broad amount of Russia, because our main character travels across different sections, I really felt like I was getting like an understanding of the vastness of this place, but also like the physicality of it, and I really liked that. I also did find it really interesting, this view on the revolution that was very critical of what was happening. It shows you through following Zhivago's story, we get to meet so many different characters who have such different philosophical outlooks, political outlooks, some people who maybe are on the same side, so whether that's revolutionary or government or that sort of thing. They might be on the same side, but they have very different like philosophical approaches to the revolution and that sort of thing. So I felt like this did a really great job of, while rooting me in these characters, it allowed me to explore this moment in history where there were so many strands going on, and that maybe if I'd read a non-fiction book about this, I might be super duper confused, but because I'm like rooted in this one person and I'm following their story and all of the tangential stories that touch on theirs, it helped me see a lot of different perspectives that people would have had at the time. This is sometimes billed as like one of the best romances in literature and stuff like this, and I have to say that's not how I felt about this. One of the plot threads in this is that Zhivago is married to his wife Tonya and they have a child together, and then also there's this woman called Lara, and I found it interesting the ways in which they sort of circled each other throughout the text before they properly met. They're like spheres touch at times, but they don't properly connect until later. And I found their interactions interesting. It's just I didn't view it as like a grand sweeping romance, which I think some people do. I felt like it was a really interesting way of sort of seeing the way that Zhivago's ideas of himself change depending on which woman he's with. You know, when he's with Lara, he views himself a certain way. When he's with Tonya, he views himself a different way. So whilst I didn't read this as a sweeping romance, I definitely think that there was a lot of interesting aspects there to do with how the romance caused you to view Zhivago. I don't know, Zhivago is one of those interesting protagonists where I'm like, I'm not sure I entirely like him, but I find him compelling, and I think that his journey is interesting. I definitely felt a little bit exhausted when I finished this because it is such this big sweeping tale that is dealing with some really heavy political things. I read this for my podcast. We take it in turns, me and my friend Mark, to pick a topic each time, and he chose this one. I'm going to include a link to that podcast episode down below because we really delved into a lot more detail on a lot of these topics that I've like briefly touched on here. So if you would like to get our fuller thoughts, Mark definitely had some really interesting thoughts. And then I would really recommend you go check that out. But on the whole, one of these classics that I'm really glad I read because it was really interesting, and it's definitely one to add to like the bank of things to mull over. All of the other books for this are non-fiction. So first up is As I Crossed a Bridge of Dreams. This is translated by Ivan Moris. This is attributed to someone called Lady Sarashina. I should say that both the title of this and the author's name are sort of given to the text because we don't know what her name or what this was called. Lady Sarashina was born in 1008 AD at like the height of like the Heian period in Japanese history. I went into this with very little knowledge because one thing I'm just like interested in exploring is classics of countries that are not my own, essentially. I feel like there are definitely some geographical locations where I know their classic texts a lot better than others, and Japan is one of those where I don't really know a lot of the foundational text. So this is just one that I picked up out of interest to get to know some of the literature a bit more. There are definitely some other texts that are now on my radar, like The Tale of Genji, like The Pillow Book, stuff like that. So if you have any recommendations of classics, doesn't have to be Japanese classics, but just classics of your country, where you're from, I would really love to hear them, because I'm sort of creating this little bank that I'm going to explore at various times. So because I came in with not a lot of knowledge, I found the introduction to this really, really helpful, because it just gave me a lot of context, both in regards to when this was written, but also the challenges in translating this, the challenges in translating especially the poetry, because the poetry was very much these poems where you can read multiple meanings into all of the specific words that were chosen and stuff, and how do you go about translating that? That was just such an interesting conundrum to think about. So this is sort of just an account of Lady Sarashina's life. It's obviously written at a later point, but she must have made notes and diaries and stuff beforehand that she's drawing upon. One thing that was really interesting is just the nature of her as a person. She's quite almost dreamy and ethereal. She kind of she loves tales, so stuff like the Tale of Genji and stuff she adores, and she kind of in some ways approaches life as if it is this tale. She's slightly set aside, she doesn't really care about progressing at court and all stuff like this. At times she can feel almost antisocial, because sometimes she just wants to be left alone to look at the moon rather than be involved in these moments that are happening. And so this almost slightly to the side approach to life was just really interesting. Sometimes it means that she can feel a bit delicate and weepy. So she gets very emotionally affected by things. And he says in his introduction, he's essentially calling her a bit wet and stuff. But I found it really interesting, because this is this woman who is so deeply affected by things. She's so deeply affected by some of the natural world. There are just some beautiful descriptions of nature and stuff in this. And it was just an interesting perspective to be viewing it from. Equally, she's really concerned with her dreams, and so she at varying points discusses dreams that she's had, and I found it weirdly funny, because she's taken the time to write down these dreams. It must be important enough for her to have remembered them and noted them down, and she tries to draw the meaning out of them and what it might be suggesting that she should do. But at no point does she ever do the things that she thinks the dream is suggesting she could do. And so then right at the end, she's like, oh, maybe my life would have turned out better if I'd have actually done those things. And I'm just we'll never know. And that was just an interesting aspect. This was just one of those ones where it was a really, really quick read, and the poems were really interesting. This way of expressing in short poetry. She's always oh, and this happened, and then I composed this poem. It was just such an interesting insight into what it might be like to be a woman living in this time, and that I just found it so engaging for that reason. It's made me want to go and do further reading, stuff like The Pillow Book. He talks about in the introduction how the woman who wrote that is in many ways much more active and that sort of thing, whereas I actually really liked, it's not passivity in this, it's just this way of approaching life that is sort of romantic and dreamy at times, and is noting down these beautiful things, and she's way more concerned with telling us her dreams and some of these things, this encounter she has with this man where they talk about these things, and then she never sees him again, and then later she just casually mentions her husband, and I'm just at what point did you get married and have children? I don't know, it was just such an interesting perspective, and the types of information that she felt were important enough to talk about, and what was just sort of oh yeah, I have 3 kids, by the way. I don't know. So it's one of those where I'm just I feel I've had a really interesting time reading it. I would really appreciate any recommendations people have of things that I might want to read after this, but on the whole, an interesting time. I also read a book on my Kindle. I read As You Wish by Carey Elwes, which is his account of filming The Princess Bride. It was an interesting read. I very much read it for a light, fun piece of non-fiction, essentially. One thing that really comes across is how much everyone involved in the filming of The Princess Bride really loved the experience that they were having, as well as Carey's own narration, there are quotations from everyone who's involved in the filming, who's still around, who wanted to contribute, and you get such a strong sense of affection. You get really strong, like, they all loved Andre the Giant deeply. That's one of the main things I've taken away from this. You get, like, also, like, fun tidbits and trivia. I never really appreciated the amount of effort they put into learning how to sword fight for the duel, stuff like this. So very much one to read if you're someone who loves The Princess Bride. I will say that the Kindle version, I sometimes found the formatting annoying because Carey would be in the middle of an anecdote and then it would be interrupted with a quotation from someone, but the quotation was nothing to do with what he was talking about, and so then I would have to read the quotation and then click onto the next page, and then Carey's anecdote would continue. I feel like potentially the formatting will be better in the actual physical book. It was just something that I found a little bit irksome, having to go like, okay, now I'm away from the anecdote, but now I'm back on the anecdote. But on the whole, it was like a perfectly lovely read, and it was sort of everything I wanted it to be. I've also heard that the audiobook is narrated by him, so potentially that would be a really fun way to consume this. The final book I wanted to talk about is Queer X Design by Andy Campbell. This is sort of a graphic design queer history. I will say this is specifically based around American queer history. I mention that because it wasn't clear on the blurb or any of the websites that I looked on before I bought this, which is not a problem because I am interested in American queer history. It's just I felt like it could have been slightly clearer that this was not like a global look. This is split into time periods, so it's like pre-liberation and then it goes through almost like decades, which was a really interesting way of doing it because it means that you're then sort of able to chart the different like concerns, the different topics that people were concerned with at different times, sort of like visual imagery, how it develops across time. So that was really interesting. I have seen some reviews of this where people were talking about how they might have preferred it if it was grouped like thematically, like, oh, here's a chapter on posters, here's a chapter on like pin badges, here's a chapter on like advertising and stuff like that, which I definitely see. I think I did find it interesting having it be chronological because you did get to see like changing developments and that sort of thing. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars because I definitely learned a lot. There were definitely like periods that I felt like I could tell from my own reading what time periods I was most familiar with. You know, like a lot of the like act up stuff like this I felt really like already confident in, but then especially pre-liberation there was a lot that was really new and interesting to me that I really enjoyed. It was also kind of interesting as we got more contemporary, the way more adverts started to feature and like logos of corporations and stuff like the human rights campaign, stuff like this. So, and that was just like, again, like an interesting aspect of going through this chronologically, was seeing how some of the things that would maybe had to be more underground and subtle, you gradually are able to get more and more like mainstream. And he does discuss sort of some of that conflict in the queer community, these ideas of like assimilating to things versus like just throwing all of that out and doing it your own way. I don't know. So definitely a really interesting read, and if you're interested in graphic design, if you're interested in queer history, there's a lot to be gained from here. I had a really fun time with it. That's everything I wanted to talk about this week. As per usual, I would really love to hear your thoughts on any of these. Do let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you're having a really lovely day, and I will see you next time for something different.